It's Ivy Slater, and you're listening to Her Success Story podcast, a show where gutsy businesswomen share their success journey. Hi, this is Ivy Slater. Welcome to today's episode of Her Success Story, where we interview amazing, interesting women and those wonderful, exceptional guys that are filled with insight on leadership and business and the avenues of growth. Today's guest is Elizabeth Kelley. She's a criminal defense lawyer with a national practice focused on representation and mitigation of people with mental disabilities. Elizabeth co-chairs the Criminal Justice Advisory Panel on the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. She is an author and an editor. Her recent book, The Suicide in the Criminal Justice System, just came out. She's also edited and authored Representing People with Mental Disabilities, a practical guide for criminal defense lawyers, as well as Representing People on the Autism spectrum, as well as representing people with dementia. You know, as I've gotten to know Elizabeth, what I understand and I admire so about her is that she is here to represent the underserved and unknown and unsupported communities of the world. So Elizabeth, thank you for joining me here today, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate being here.
So, always curious. When we were little, and I always, I ask sometimes this question, I was like, we're little, I wanted to be a dancer. I remember when my son was little, he wanted to be a garbage man because he loved that. When we walked to school and he saw the garbage truck, I said, why do you want to be a garbage man? He goes, I love when it goes crunch in the back. This area of criminal defense, of truly serving the population that is not talked about much, not known, yet is part of the criminal justice system. Did you find it? Did it find you? How did this develop?
A combination thereof. I started practicing criminal defense, and I was assigned a client one day who had what we used to call mental retardation. We now call it an intellectual or developmental disability. And I worked very closely with this young man and his caseworker and this family. He was actually charged as an accomplice for being a lookout during a string of robberies that were orchestrated by his so-called friends. They basically took advantage of him, and we see that a good deal among people with mental disabilities in the criminal justice system. And we were able to fashion a sentence that protected the community as well as ensured that he would not get in trouble again. And as any business starts, your reputation spreads if you do a good job. And his caseworkers started passing my business card out to the families of other people charged with crimes. And the business just started growing. And then I had my first client who had a mental illness. And so the skill set was largely the same. And I've developed a real expertise in and reputation for handling these types of cases. And I don't have any type of medical background or psychology or psychiatry background. I'm just a lawyer, but I worked the cases, and I was always fortunate that I had very good experts who were willing to share with me their knowledge. And I also realized that there was a tremendous need among the criminal defense bar for knowledge of this kind. So other criminal defense lawyers started reaching out to me for assistance. Even judges started reaching out to me for assistance. And I realized that representing people with mental disabilities was not only the kind of practice which meant the most to me, like your little boy loving the sound of the crunch of the garbage,
Right.
but also there was a real niche for me within this field.
And it's interesting because I was just thinking the same thing as you were speaking. In as I talk to various different businesses over the years, it's always advised, how are you niching down? What's your specialty? How can you refine that further? And sometimes it's so often that the business leaders are looking for their niche. And then sometimes the niche finds us. And it's that one experience that just kind of hooks you in. And it sits right professionally, and it sits right in your heart. And once you find and you develop your niche, the sky's the limit.
You're absolutely right. The only caveat is that you need to be focused on your niche. Don't get distracted by something else that you think is more plentiful in the marketplace, something that you think might be more lucrative. Stick with this.
So, in this niche market, when we're talking about the criminal justice system and we're talking about demographics of people with mental and intellectual disabilities, we're looking at the dementia and Alzheimer's issues. We're even looking at suicide now. How do you build a practice? Of course, you think about referrals, but in the early, do you network? And if so, how? Like, networking is a broad thing. When you have a practice that goes across the United States, what are some of the strategies you've used in expanding?
Well, first of all, marketing for any type of legal services is very different in my mind than marketing for other, if you will, consumer goods. First of all, this is a service. So it's not as if you are putting out a sign for the world's best bagel. And even if someone doesn't like bagels or doesn't need a bagel, the investment is relatively small and they will buy a bagel from you and move on. But my service is delayed. So someone may meet me at a cocktail party or hear me speak at a continuing legal education seminar and remember my name, put my business card in their pocket. And then 5 years down the line, if they're an attorney, they have a current corporate client whose son gets into trouble, or their Uncle Hank may get picked up, and Uncle Hank has always been a little bit eccentric. And truth be known, Uncle Hank is part of that generation on the autism spectrum, which was never formally diagnosed. Yeah. So a lot of it is just casting the net wide, being visible, educating people about what I do, and knowing that one day they may reach out to me.
And I agree with you. And I think such an important piece of marketing is about the education.
Exactly.
Sharing knowledge forward, letting us all hear the stories, because we all know someone somehow that has been affected by something, from, if it's the intellectual disabilities world, if it's the dementia, autism, Alzheimer's world, and I'm just looping them all together. But it's, I could tell you, you know, in a hand, I could start counting people within my world of people I know from personal close relationships that when we were connected, I was like, wow, I really want to talk about this because it's not spoken of enough. Because this is a
Exactly, because of the
community.
stigma,
Right.
and sometimes because of just a lack of knowledge. So, and also it's in many circumstances, a quote unquote invisible disability.
Yeah.
Some people who have a profound mental illness or a profound intellectual or developmental disability are very visible. You know when you encounter them that there is something different. But with many people who have mental disabilities, they have spent their entire lives trying to mask that, either because they want to fit in or they're afraid of being bullied. And also in many families, those family members try and cover up the fact, or they may deny the fact, or they also may blame themselves for the specific disability. For instance, it used to be that mothers were blamed because the mother was distant, or if someone's side of the family had a mental disability, it sometimes was a bar to a couple having children. So, and also mental disabilities are not something that you can just fix. So for instance, if your loved one is charged with a crime, you just can't get the court to dismiss the case and send the loved one off to a private clinic, and then everything will be better. In many, if not most, if not all circumstances, the disability is lifelong and will always have to be managed in some fashion.
And I think that's hard for all of us to understand, that it's not something that you might be ill for a few years and then you'll navigate through it. It's not something that even if you have some kind of chronic something, there's so many autoimmune, et cetera, you do a couple of things and you manage it on a whole. Your day to day is 100%, you know, routine, you know, business as usual, so to speak. And it's different. How do we, as a society and in supporting more of what we can do to help?
Well, I think
help. Go ahead.
I think even before one can help, one has to understand, and one has to not only tolerate but appreciate. And a place to begin is in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, and understand that people with mental disabilities, if they are capable of fitting in some fashion, of doing the job in some fashion, have so much to contribute, not only from a knowledge and a productivity standpoint, but just making the entire experience interesting and creating an experience from which everyone can benefit and grow. And I should stress that the majority of people with mental disabilities, if they receive the proper support within their community, whether it's education, housing, transportation, medication, or just love and support from their family and friends, they will never get in trouble. They will never have a loved one reach out to me about a pending indictment. But when someone with a mental disability is charged with a crime, chances are that if the criminal defense lawyer, if the prosecutor, if the judge has had some sort of experience in their life with someone with a mental disability, they will understand the situation, they will be more empathetic, and within the realm and within the confines of their roles, they will serve justice.
So, in taking the conversation forward, you shared as we got on that you have a new piece, a new book.
Yes.
The suicide in the criminal justice system.
Yes.
What drove you to now jump in and write this piece next?
I have a wonderful co-editor. Her name is Dr. Francesca Flood, and she is from Northern Virginia. And she and I were introduced by a mutual colleague a number of years ago. And we just started talking about suicide, about defendants, about clients who attempt suicide. And if you've been doing criminal defense work for any amount of time, you have someone who attempts suicide or actually goes through with the attempt and meets their death. And it's something that people don't talk about, but it's something that sticks with you for years, if not decades. And there's not a lot of research about this. In fact, there's not even a lot of statistics about this. Periodically, you read a report in the media about someone charged with a crime who commits suicide, and there's a bit of attention. Maybe the conditions at the jail or the prison are re-examined, and then we as a society move on. And so our threshold concern was getting statistics, and we couldn't find them easily for defendants in custody. And we had an even more difficult time getting statistics for people charged with crime who were out on bond, pending disposition of their case, who attempted suicide or who actually went through, and I don't like to use the term succeeded. Yeah. So one day I just got mad and I took out my cyber Rolodex, and we started emailing 500 of my closest and dearest colleagues and asking them to ask their networks, have you ever had a client who committed suicide or who attempted suicide? And we started getting responses.
Really?
And they virtually all said the same thing. Number one, how could I have missed this? And number two, what could I have done differently? And there were other common themes that ran throughout it, but nonetheless, those were the dominant themes. And we realized that there was a huge need for attorneys to talk about this, even for judges to talk about this. So we wrote a book.
So it's interesting because you've mentioned judges several times in different contexts. How do you actually educate judges? How do you, because I realize, the American Bar Association is fabulous, and there's so many wonderful CLEs that you could be educating a vast majority of attorneys on the importance of these matters. But how does it go up above that to the judges and what they need to know?
Well, a couple things. First of all, judges will be the first to tell you that they are human too.
Right.
And secondly, all judges in virtually every jurisdiction was a practicing lawyer at some point, whether a prosecutor or a defense attorney or involved with a nonprofit. So they have a basis. And now they are in a position to not necessarily do something, but to create an atmosphere that is more conducive to conversation. So for instance, in our book, the opening chapter is written by Jennifer K. Johnson, a superb criminal defense lawyer from San Francisco, who was the chief of the felony division in San Francisco. And she discusses how, as a very, very young lawyer, there was a client, the client of a colleague who committed suicide. And that had a profound impact, not just on her, but throughout the entire courthouse. And that inspired a judge to start a mental health court. And then we have another chapter in the book written by Judge Ginger Lerner Wren from Broward County, Florida, who discusses her growing awareness of suicide across America. And her court is called a no suicide zone. Her court is a mental health court, but also her court actively promotes wellness, not only for the staff and the attorneys, which are part of the court, but certainly for the defendants. And then we have another chapter written by Judge Stephen Boo, of the Western District of Missouri, who calls his chapter When Judges Cry.
Wow.
And he talks about the suicides that have occurred in the federal court and the impact it has on staff as well as the entire legal community, and some proactive steps that he and other federal judges have taken to promote wellness.
Well, Elizabeth, it is interesting, it is fascinating, and it's important work. And I thank you for spearheading the initiation on so much of this, and your dedication to the communities that need to be heard more of. We need to be hearing more about this. We need to be, as a society, continuing education so we can continue to help and support. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, I enjoy talking about this, and I certainly enjoy talking to you, and would love to be on your podcast again.
So Elizabeth, share with our listeners, how can they learn more, continue to learn and educate, and find you as a resource?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I have a website which reflects my name, ElizabethKelleyLaw.com. That's Elizabeth with a Z, and Kelley is spelled Kelley. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Mental Health ESQ. And if you are really, really interested in who I am and what I do, you can subscribe to my newsletter on my website, or you can go to the American Bar Association's website, shopaba.org, and you can buy my books on mental disabilities, on autism, on suicide, or in a few months on dementia.
Awesome. Elizabeth, thank you. Listeners, you know what I say at the end of every podcast for those of you who are regulars here is take a moment and identify the one takeaway. What by listening today impacted you and what action you're going to follow through in taking regarding that. So it's always about, we dedicate ourselves to listening and learning and the impact and the follow through on the taking of the action. So feel free to leave a note down below in what your takeaway is and what you are going to do about it. Remember to hit subscribe. We come into your inbox every Monday morning with great interviews as well as content episodes all about business growth, interesting areas of business and strategy. I look forward to seeing you, ladies and gentlemen, next time. Thank you from Her Success Story.
Don't need your approval anymore, 'cause I've got my